Hello, viewers. Today I'm going to continue to talk about Final Fantasy VIII. I was doing some research into old websites having to do with mainly people have written blogs about Rinoa and Ultimecia as a theory of them being the same as a theory. And I have to say, although I am finding that many of the websites are still up, there are some rotten links, there are some dead websites, or some very unoperative, or rather, some unresponsive domain names. This is a very old theory. This is a very old idea, but I am not calling it a theory, so to speak, as a belief. Because basically, I've been trying to find people who believe it, like I did. Back when I was playing these games, there were no sequels. We had very few spin-off games. We had a few games that were spin-offs, and regarding Squaresoft, like Final Fantasy Tactics and Urkiage. But for the most part, what we got from those 4 discs, that was it. We were left to speculate. And one thing that Final Fantasy used to be very good with, because basically, in my opinion, ever since Hironobu Sakaguchi left, Square Enix, Final Fantasy has been dead. Final Fantasy has been dead to me. And I have to say, that is still the case, in my opinion. So, what we got out of those 4 discs, or what we got out of those 3 discs of Final Fantasy VII, that was what it was. There was nothing else. So, people speculating was not something really that serious. It was just people used to have very good conversations. But eventually, around the time of Square Enix, things became a good deal more, how should I say, more polarizing. In other words, as the stories and the characters started to be expanded upon, even though we have about 4 discs worth of expansion to know all of the characters of Final Fantasy VIII, and every aspect of it. And, we have that, we have Final Fantasy VIII covered in Final Fantasy Mobius, Final Fantasy Dissidia games, and the like. Out of all of those Dissidia games, I like NT the most because Final Fantasy NT, it seemed as though I was not really receiving much detailed information about the story in regard to just characters sort of really doing much. And I suppose that was of course a big weakness for NT, and that was one of the reasons why it was not as popular as the earlier Dissidias. However, for me, I like the gameplay, I like the graphics, they look really good, and I like the fact that I could play as, Rinoa, Ultimecia, and Squall. I could just have the whole team. That really was excellent. But, one thing that I had begun to think about again was the fact that, about 2 years ago, Katsushige, I suppose, I do not know if I'm pronouncing it the correct way, Nojima. He had said on his Twitter he does not want to talk about his games on Twitter anymore. Now, for those of you who watched Yoshinori Kitase retract the statement about Rinoa being Ultimecia, he happens to say, during the writing of Final Fantasy VIII, he made special mention of Nojima. One moment, I have to I'm going to return in one moment, viewers. Alright. He had made special mention of Mr. Nojima. And basically, he was talking about his style of writing and how, to sum up, basically, Nojima's writing is sort of special. He can hide stuff in his writing and do very secretive, innovative things when he writes. And I thought that was interesting. So apparently, Nojima, he is one of the most famous story and scenario writers. He's written for a lot of games, especially Final Fantasy games. But he is not going to talk to anyone on Twitter about the stories. So, in my opinion, I think a lot of the expectations and the sort of fan frenzies that people have around the characters being reused over and over again, like they want to know all of the details about Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9, those old ones. They want to have those details. And so their writers, they know the original stories because they wrote for Squaresoft during those days when Hironobu Sakaguchi was still at Square, basically still involved. When he was, basically the person directing the creation of these Final Fantasy games, which he created. Now, those writers, all of those writers are rather in a precarious position, because what they must do is not really reveal anything about the old stories, because they use a lot of the old story content, and basically in some cases, just like in the case of Bethesda, many people call them Bugthesda because their games have so many bugs. But anyhow, a lot of people have a problem with Bethesda in that they have taken the old story content of the original games and changed it so much to the point where a lot of the meaning of the story is gone. And I think Final Fantasy is in a similar position, where you have the old writers who still work for the company, as it now is, being Square Enix. They used to work for the old Squaresoft, but now they're still working there. But Hironobu Sakaguchi is no longer directing the games. Whatever type of meaning the games used to have is no longer, let us be honest, whatever original meaning Final Fantasy VII had, whoever is directing how these Final Fantasy games are made, whatever investors they have, they want these Final Fantasy games to be completely different. They want them to be remade to be more beneficial to their business strategy and their own sort of views of what Final Fantasy should be. And of course, that was obvious when they started to make sequels. And I think that, to be honest, a lot of these writers are scared that if they even talk a little bit about what those stories could, used to, whatever little minute details they could give, and I'm pretty sure that they would be penalized for it in some way. Because when I think about what Square Enix does now, think about the scale of something like Final Fantasy VII Remake. If they have done it with Final Fantasy VII, do you really think that they do not want to remake 8 and 9 in the same way. Now, of course, based upon what type of business they are, doing in regard to their poor sales, they may never do that, because people are not really buying their product as much as they would want them to. However, when you think about the strategy behind remaking Final Fantasy VII, if the writers even respond to a person's message asking about the original story, if someone knows the original story, then they will say, hey, well, Kitase or Nojima told me that the story's this way. So you have things that are done at specific times that seem to be very interesting. Because when I think about Final Fantasy Dissidia NT, which was what Kitase was being interviewed for, when he actually said that he can't really say whether or not the theory holds water or not, basically because he was not the only writer. But before, he said no, that's not the case. And then he changed his stance and his position and completely retracted it, and basically said he does not know. There were at least 3 or so writers. Now, I think all of these people know, and I know that may be sort of an unpopular opinion, because how could you say Yoshinori is lying? How could you say Yoshinori is not being entirely honest? But for me, in regard to these companies, I think that there is some business strategy behind everything that they say. When I look at the remake and basically what has come of it, and I just think about all of the spin-offs that Square Enix has done, it has become very clear to me that they are not good at creating original ideas anymore, especially in regard to unique settings, characters, scenarios, and stories, and that Squaresoft was the golden age in regard to what they could do and what they are capable of. In other words, based upon what I've seen, I do not think Square Enix will ever really get out of the shadow of the Squaresoft glory days. I really do not think they will be able to recapture those old 90s titles like Final Fantasy VII, 8, and 9. And because they cannot, I think what they are doing is trying to remake and sort of reinvigorate the fervor and vigor of those old fans, while at the same time getting new fans to come into the series and really adopt to a more simplistic story and a more simplistic battle system, real-time action game, not like the old games where you just stand in place and have an active time battle system. And I think they are trying to do two things at once. They are making remakes like Final Fantasy VII Remake and plan to remake Final Fantasy IX after Final Fantasy VII. This is the talk that hath been coming out of the company. And people have been basically, gossiping about it. You did not hear them saying they wanted to remake Final Fantasy VIII. Did you, though? Not yet. Well, that was one reason, was because Final Fantasy VIII apparently, and personally I would consider sales to be more of an indication of its popularity. But anyhow, apparently many people say that, this is the talk, that Final Fantasy VIII is, one of the least popular Final Fantasy games for whatever reason. Apparently because of the battle system and just how complex the story was, which for those of us who played this game before the newer games came out, we got to think about it more than other people did. And I think because those games, were just games that did not have any sequels at the time or any spin-offs like Dissidia at the time, you really got to sort of have more of a grasp of the characters being unique, as well as the endings and the stories and really every aspect of the game. Things were more final during that time. So after I completed it, um, basically, and I saw the ending, I came to the conclusion, wow, why are we seeing Ultimecia's face in the little ballroom that Rinoa and Squall were dancing in? What could this possibly be? And I kept remembering how Ultimecia was saying, oh, if I could only go back, oh, do you remember a time during your childhood? As though, Ultimecia has some time during her childhood or younger days that she wants us to go back to. And when you think about these characters, what age was Rinoa when she met Squall? What age is she in the game? She basically is a child. She's basically, 16 or 17 or something like that. She is not even 18 yet. None of these characters are 18 yet. And when you think about that, and it is kind of weird to think that we are basically dealing with some child soldiers, in a sense. Not to say they're necessarily children, but they're not quite adults yet either. They are teenagers who are almost 18, but they're not quite 18. And I forget what age Quistis was. Maybe she was 17, maybe she was 18. She was one of the older ones, of course. But nonetheless, Ultimecia is saying, oh, if we could go, do you remember? And she is being very personal with the characters, almost as though what she is saying has some significance. Now, you have to remember, in the original Final Fantasy VIII, there was no backstory like there is in Dissidia Opera Omnia. And frankly, there was no intention for Final Fantasy VIII to have any type of sequel or spin-offs or any of those titles, because this came after Hironobu Sakaguchi left. So for me, I have to think from that framework, even though there are other people who really do not want to think from that framework. They want to say that all of this stuff is Squaresoft canon. It may be Square Enix canon, but it is not Squaresoft canon. Anyhow, what we see in the ending is that Ultimecia and Rinoa, her face shifteth to where she is in the ballroom, and it is almost as though Rinoa is Ultimecia. Her face is shifting and shaping, and it looks weird, but it looks almost as though Rinoa's face is different. Now, in Dissidia, because this is a later game and they're making the characters have more defined features, they look different. But in Final Fantasy VIII, she looked very much similar to her facial shape. And I cannot really speak to the facial shape in Dissidia because I have not really examined it that much. But basically in Final Fantasy VIII, the facial shape had shifted from Ultimecia to Rinoa, and they were all in the ballroom, and that was the ending. And a lot of people who want to basically challenge many of our claims as being the believers in Rinoa being Ultimecia, because at this point, I would say, at least from my perspective, I am a believer. This is not a theory to me. This is how it was to me. It may be something different to someone else, but based upon my understanding, this game, Final Fantasy VIII, was extremely esoteric. But anyhow, as I was saying, we have things like that in the game. When you think about what was done during that extremely intense fight with Ultimecia, with the script, that fight and what she said after it, very intense. But when I thought about it, and when I saw the ending, it made sense to me. I said, oh, that is what Ultimecia is talking about. She was talking about that time when she first sort of met Squall. That was a time, that she wants us to go back to, but her memories, of course, are sort of, the idea is that the reason she does not have a backstory is because she is Rinoa, who has her memories affected by the GF, the Guardian Force Griever, to such an extent that she cannot really, even think, straight. She, does not have a backstory because her mind, her memories are lost, just like the characters' memories are being lost. And when you think about how long she has had griever junction to her body and what that has done to her mind, she is not necessarily a character who is, she remembers something faintly, I think, and I think she wants us to go back to it. And I think in that split second, it almost seemeth as though it is a dream. But, during the ending, who do you see in the ballroom? You see Rinoa, but her face is shifting to Ultimecia's. And you see Squall there. That was the memory that Ultimecia was talking about. That was the thing that she wanted to go back to. Because apparently that gave her a lot of happiness. And if we know anything about, Rinoa, we know that she had a relationship with both, Cypher and Squall. And Ultimecia, we know Ultimecia has a relationship with Cypher that is very interesting, in which, Cypher is he is very enthusiastic about being her sorceress knight. But anyhow, as I was saying, we have all these nuances in the story that I am going to talk about more often in these videos. Of course, you already know it if you've watched the previous ones. But anyhow, viewers, the writers are not really eager to talk about these things, especially Nojima. And there's something to this. The fact that they're still here, the fact that there's new leadership and Square Enix is not doing very well, and they can continue to bring up these old ideas and reuse them for new Dissidia games, but you see, for whatever reason, whatever formula they are using is not working so well, they are still losing money. You may not realize this, Square Enix is having a bad reputation. They've tried to branch out with things like Luminous Productions, or whatever this happened to be called, with things like Forspoken. But for whatever reason, they, of course, with Forspoken, the main protagonist was a black woman, a woman of the black social status, and of course, many gamers who have their little racial preferences, they won't like playing as a black woman, who have sort of a, who is more black culturally and sort of is supposed to be playing a black New Yorker character. That was something new. But you see, I think the game's reputation, Final Fantasy has sort of grown to such an extent that, in a way, the fanatics will not let Square Enix sort of go anywhere else. If they do something like Forspoken, the players say, "Oh, this is terrible. Make Final Fantasy such and such, or do this." So in a sense, I can understand why they continue to just use the same characters over and over again, and just continue to do spin-off projects. And we're talking about sequels to some of these games, or at least in the form of remakes, because they I think one of the reasons they went the direction they did in regard to the Final Fantasy VII remake was because they sort of have a realization that many people speak badly of the sequels that they do. For example, their last big sequel was Final Fantasy XIII, 2, Final Fantasy XIII, Lightning Returns, the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy. People did not respond well to that. People did not even really respond all that well to Final Fantasy 15 DLC. Excuse me. So they're in a situation where they know people love the old Final Fantasy games, but they do not want to make sequels of them. But at the same time, the people do not want sequels for the most part. They know people want them to remaster these games or remake these games and really make them better, but at the same time, Square Enix wants to remake these games to be more amenable to their brand. So they see the idea of doing a whole remake as basically a sort of coy way of doing a sequel that, not necessarily a sequel a real, sort of remaking of an idea, absolutely changing every aspect of it. So we can see they have remastered Final Fantasy. They've remastered just about every Final Fantasy game. In some cases, multiple times. But the problem I see with Square Enix is that it seemeth as though Square Enix is having somewhat of the same problem that Koei Tecmo does in regard to Dynasty Warriors. Everyone wanteth a Dynasty Warriors game, but every time, Koei Tecmo trieth to innovate, what will happen is that the players, for example, Dynasty Warriors 9, they did a lot of different things, but Dynasty Warriors 9 was different than the earlier Dynasty Warriors. People want the old system back. They do not like the new. For the most part, most players do not like the old system. So, in this sense, Square Enix is in a situation where people want the old Squaresoft days back, but with the technology being as it is, and the industry being as it is with investors, they do not want people to take their time and do a 4-disc game, not to mention the fact that doing a 4-disc game with this manner of technology that they have in this day and age, in this particular, in these contemporary times, it would take a massive amount of money to produce something with such good graphics and give you a 4-disc box set like they did in the old days. I think the problem that Square Enix is having is that their games were too, Squaresoft games were too good. And I think for the big three, the trifecta, so to speak, of the PlayStation that were released on the PlayStation of Final Fantasy VII, VIII, and IX, they had such significant stories and such wide-ranging dialogue and so much content in them regarding those, a 4-disc set for Final Fantasy VIII, 4-disc set for Final Fantasy IX, 3-disc set for Final Fantasy VII. It may seem insignificant now, but those games offered us a vast deal, a great deal. But you see, back in those days, you could release all of that content. You could have all manner of nuances to your game. These days, the games, let me be honest, based on what I've experienced, they are not as long as those Final Fantasy games. I still think about the time I spent playing them, and sure, you spend a good deal of time grinding, but there were a lot of nuances to those games. You could go to Final Fantasy VII, you could go to Gold Saucer, you could play all of the games. You had all different types of activities you could do outside of combat. There were things to collect. There were little nuances to the game, that you could really investigate. You could there was a lot of heart put into those games. Alright? I think the only thing that you could compare those games to, you cannot really compare Elden Ring to them, because Elden Ring, although they had an excellent environment, there was a problem with a lack of story content. There was a problem with a lack of people to talk to. Now, in regard to the DLC, that is a different story, because that is coming after the original installment. But anyhow, what I mean to say is that Square Enix is in a pretty bad situation. And so, for them, these old characters, even old villains like Ultimecia, they want everything to be malleable and open-ended so they can change them how they like. Alright? These stories cannot end. And that is the problem. The idea of Final Fantasy was the finality of the fantasy. In other words, when you play Final Fantasy VII a long time ago, when you used to do that, you could know that the ending you got was the ending you got. The fantasy that you received was the fantasy that you received due to the work of Hironobu Sakaguchi and his team. That was what it was. Okay? It was all due to their work. It was all due to their conception. Okay? And you could kind of tell that some of that stress of basically creating such a series sort of affected Sakaguchi in his creation of games like Last Story, Lost Odyssey. I mean, that the very name Last Story sort of indicates Sakaguchi's original method of making the game final, his RPG sort of final. In other words, he wanted that experience to be unique, to be novel. But I have to say that has been lost in Final Fantasy. You know, and so with Nojima, this is a matter of him keeping his job. He does not want to talk about anything that he used to, any type of details that he wrote for these old stories like, Final Fantasy VIII. No, he cannot talk about that, because they may decide, hey, we want to use Squall or Rinoa for something different, or we want to do a whole Final Fantasy VIII remake, and we need to change details about what the original story was. And you see that in the case of Final Fantasy VII Remake. You see that in the case of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Final Fantasy VII Interglade, or all of these different names for their different episodic, installments. These older Final Fantasy installments really are all Final Fantasy, all Square Enix hath left, because their company is not doing well. Their company is really doing bad right now. They're losing a lot of money these days. And people like me, like myself, I gave up on the company after the Final Fantasy 13 trilogy. Okay? And Final Fantasy 14. After that, I said, I do not even want to play Final Fantasy 15. For one thing, no one in the game looks like me. I mean, there was not even one black character as far as I know. Everybody was basically, all of the rest of the, most of the characters were pale folk. I mean, you didn't see much dark skin, or brown skin, reddish brown skin, ruddy brown skin. That you didn't really see that, and so I did not really connect to it. I really liked Final Fantasy 13. Final Fantasy 14 was alright for me. I think Final Fantasy 11 was better, but nonetheless, what I have to say is that, what we are witnessing in regard to Square Enix is pretty bad. I mean, but none of us should be surprised. Had they kept with Sakaguchi's vision for Final Fantasy, peradventure they would be in a better situation, but they did not. And a lot of what they have been trying to do, it has not been working. Maybe they should not have fired him, personally, but for sure, And I suppose with Lost Odyssey, I think, especially Lost Odyssey, I think Hironobu Sakaguchi really wanted to show, that you can make a game with superior technology and really keep the spirit of it as being a very good product, a very, one of his original, a game with his original style and unique, finality to it. You can make a game like that. So I think he proved that with Lost Story and Last Odyssey. Oh goodness, I completely ruined the names of those. One moment, viewers. But Hironobu Sakaguchi proved with Mistwalker that you can still make a good RPG that has finality to it, that has a complete story to it, with Lost Odyssey and Last Story. And they are well acclaimed, even though they are not necessarily well known. One of the reasons being is that I believe Lost Odyssey is an Xbox exclusive. But imagine if that title was being released for, as a Final Fantasy game. But I think he made those games to sort of show Square Enix that, yeah, this is what you are missing, because obviously I can still make good games, that are far better than whatever any of you people at Square Enix are making. And I think that was sort of something he did to prove himself, to prove that, yes, he is, even without being a part of Square Enix, he can make an excellent and a very competent title. And he did. I mean, Lost Odyssey and Last Story are cult classics. But regarding the writers, many of us who I think were dissuaded from talking about our ideas regarding Ultimecia, I think a lot of us, I had mentioned this before, we should feel a good deal more boldness to speak. And I think a lot of the arguments that were had on forums, and I've been reading some of the forums in which this conversation hath been occurring, and I have to say that oftentimes it seems as though people are extremely rude about people even mentioning any of their unique beliefs regarding Ultimecia. I mean, so much so that people will outright call you stupid. They will, say, oh, Yoshinori Kitase said this is not true. Many of those people have not read the new information about Yoshinori Kitase retracting his statement, about, 5 or so years ago? And many people are not even up to date regarding information, but you still have people who say it because they think they know so much, and they have something against people who have a belief that Rinoa is Ultimecia. And that belief is offensive to some people for some reason. Now, why? I cannot quite say. This was a very popular belief during the early days of the game. When we were playing it when we were kids, we were talking about this. There were all manner of blog sites and different websites you could find where people were really, really sharing this information. And I am lucky that I can record some of it. And hopefully I can preserve it. Maybe put it on an archive site or something like that. Maybe you can find some of these old websites on the Wayback Machine. Because a lot of information has a potential of being lost. And not to say that these connections are hard to make in regard to Ultimecia and Rinoa, but it is a shame that a lot of these old websites are not really going to, a lot of these old blogs are not really going to be around. And a lot of people, after being basically maligned and, treated badly on the forums, a lot of people just decide that they're going to share their beliefs about Ultimecia and Rinoa on their own blog sites and little WordPress sites and things like that. So, I will be looking for more information. But as I said, I do not know the future of Square Enix, and to be honest, I really do not care so much. And one of the reasons I do not is because the Square Enix the Squaresoft rather, that I knew is gone. And I think, in a sense, even though they bring out Hironobu Sakaguchi every now and then to say something, I think that's more of a just to keep good relations, just to sort of promote the company and have him come and basically, say some things as the founder who no longer worketh for the company, to basically, make them, oh, this is the creator of Final Fantasy, he made it originally, let's have him on for an event, or, let us do an interview with him or talk to him. Let us have him do a Square Enix event. But no, if he was still there, they would most likely fire him. Their investors would fire him. They would say, no, you have to make your games action games. They have to be faster. You put too many details in the story. We do not want that. So I think in a way, Hironobu Sakaguchi already knows that what his original Final Fantasy game was ended when he left, because the Final Fantasy games are no longer final. How are they the Final Fantasy when you have more games coming out, expanding upon the story? And that's one of the things that I really do not like. For a game like Dissidia Opera Omnia, to dare to expand upon Ultimecia's story when obviously the first game, which settled the story, because, Hironobu Sakaguchi and those people had made games in which there were no sequels. There were not supposed to be. There were no spin-off titles for Ultimecia. Ultimecia was what Ultimecia was, and we did not know a thing about her unless we were able to conceive the idea, Ultimecia does have a story, because Ultimecia is Rinoa. Rinoa had a relationship with Cypher and Squall, so it makes perfect sense that Ultimecia hath a relationship with Cypher, because she knew Cypher and she had a romantic relationship with him. You see how easy those connections are to make? And when you look at the ending and you see her face literally shift from, Ultimecia to Rinoa, and they're in the same ballroom that Rinoa danced in when she met Squall, and if you were not able to conceive that, this memory is very important to whoever this person is, it seemeth as though this memory, this place is important to Rinoa and Ultimecia, because they're both sort of present there, the face is shifting there, and there's something being told to us. Now, if you take the story in that way, and you were able to conceive the story in that manner, if you are able to believe that, and believe simply meaneth to accept. Some people cannot accept it, some people cannot believe it. I myself believe it. So that is why I really enjoy the story of Final Fantasy VIII. And I think what many Final Fantasy VIII players who dislike us, I think one of the reasons some Final Fantasy VIII players dislike people who believe that Rinoa is Ultimecia is because they do not like how much we enjoy the game. And they know deep in their hearts that they will never enjoy the game as much as we do. Because we sort of see in the story something, somewhat esoteric, somewhat occult. And when you consider the fact that this is a game about witches, and that witches practice the occult, they practice the esoteric, they practice secret things, obviously, you seeing something secretive in the story maketh the story all the more enjoyable for ye. There's something about a story that has a certain degree of mystery to it, and I think there's a degree of jealousy for a person who cannot believe that Rinoa is Ultimecia, because for them, they think, how can you think this? And we look at the black wings, we look at the white wings, we look at the fact that these are the only two sorceresses with black and with wings. There's only two sorceresses in this game that have wings, and they both happen to have feathers on them. One is evil, the evil one has black feathers, the good one has white feathers. There are so many parallels between Rinoa and Ultimecia to the point of ridiculousness. You also, if you research the name Ultimecia, and I think both names have a connection to Ultimecia, because Ultimecia, the root word of Ultimecia is ultimate, and if you consider that Ultimecia is the last in a succession of sorceresses, and that ultimate meaneth a last in a succession, so of the end, the ultimate, and that if you consider, Rinoa Rinoa to have become the ultimate sorceress at some point. You can do a play on words there, and you can also do a play on words where you connect that to Ultimecia, who is a real historical figure, who is a woman, and she loved someone so much, her husband or whoever, so much that when he died, she had his ashes being brought to her. She had his ashes brought to her, and what she would do is drink his ashes. She missed him so much, she was so in love with him, that she drank his ashes. Now you hear about the fact that Rinoa is a Japanese derivative of the English Lenore. If you read about the Edgar Allan Poe story, The Raven, there is, as far as I know, that was the love interest of the main character. But in that story, there's someone, and I may have to look back at that story. But basically, Lenore in The Raven. Lenore. Let me use this particular search. Lenore in The Raven. Now, this was an Edgar Allan Poe short story. But basically, there's a raven in the story that saith forevermore, forevermore, and it is a story that hath a good deal of pain in it. It's thought to be his deceased wife. And there's this raven in the story, and it's saying forevermore. And the character is sort of tortured to an extent by this raven. Now, if you consider the idea that Rinoa as a Japanese name, there's talk about Rinoa being a derivative of Eleonora. Lenore is a derivative, a variation of Eleonora, which meaneth light. Okay? So, in a sense, we have that concept of loss here in the story. If you do some research in regard to names, you can learn that Lenore and Rinoa, as names, apparently are connected. Because Rinoa is a very specific Japanese name, but it is related to Eleonora. It is related to the same root words, so to speak. Lenoa, or, in the French. In the French it's Lenoa, in the Japanese it is Rinoa. So Rinoa is of Irish origin and a Japanese form of Lenore. Now, if you, just like I said, you have that concept of loss in the raven. The idea of finality, forevermore. In other words, he's going to, now you could say this idea of, he's going to love her forever or remember her forever. This raven is saying, forevermore, or maybe feels like he's parted from her forever. I do not remember how the story went, but I know that there was this concept of eternity, a bond with this woman who, for him, it feeleth as though his sanity is sort of leaving him as this raven continueth to say, oh, forevermore, forevermore. That is what I remember about the story. I may have to read it again. But anyhow, it was a really hurtful, painful story. Now, just like in the case of this Ultimecia, whoever this woman was, apparently there was a woman, she loved her husband so much who died. She said, bring me his ashes. I am going to drink them. I even want him to be a part of me. Okay, she was drinking his ashes. And there are some women who will do this. When you think about the GF, the Guardian Force Griever, what a strange name. Grieving, but who is going to grieve? Peradventure, at one point in time, this was the idea of grief that Squall had when he was alone with, at the orphanage with, the other kids, but maybe he wanted to know who his father was. Maybe he was lonely. Maybe he was grieving. Maybe that was the first time he was grieving, and he sort of kept this idea of the lion, and that gave him strength. And maybe, if what we believe is true, at some point Rinoa is left alone without Squall. And she has this sort of lifespan that will not end forevermore, but without the one that she loveth. And she probably, if you know anything about a Guardian Force, you can junction it, but you can also unequip it. She must have held on to that GF, that Guardian Force, that was Squall's sort of thought form, so to speak. If you do any research into magic, if you do any research in theosophy, you will know what I'm saying is true. There's the idea of you being able to manifest or create something with your mind, an idea. Now, we really do not need to go into too many specifics about that, but basically, whatever that Guardian Force was, that griever, Rinoa would have kept, if what we are saying is true, and we believe it is, she would have held on to this griever for her life. And she would have really tried to assimilate her mind to this idea of the strength of the lion. And you have that song that playeth when you are fighting Greiver. Maybe I'm a lion. And then what do you see? You see that, Ultimecia fully junctions her body to Greiver on a physical level, to where her and Greiver are, this is, her flesh is now a part of Greiver. She does that. And they are so one. Because I think, in a sense, you could say that she became, I think that is symbolic in the sense that, no, this idea of Greiver is the only thing that's keeping her strong. And she cannot let it be destroyed. She is going to fight the party for this time compression which she wanteth to achieve, because this is the only way she can gain any type of peace. When you think about her black wings being raven's wings, the fact that Rinoa has a name that is just like the name Lenore, it is a Japanese variation, all right, of Lenore. This goeth back to the story to Raven. When you think about those connections, you can understand why we believe what we believe. And I'm, of course, talking about fellow believers. For those of us who believe this is not some theory. No, this was the Squaresoft game we played. This wasn't any of that Square Enix garbage. Oh no, this was, not to say that Dissidia NT is garbage, because this is the only thing that I really liked that came out of Square Enix. But I have to say, for those of us who played Final Fantasy VIII as a Squaresoft game, no, in a way, I sort of thought of, Rinoa is sort of a dove, and in a sense, Ultimecia is sort of a black raven. Okay, and I think when you think about her name, who is Lenore? Lenore is from the Raven. The Raven is saying forevermore, forevermore. Ultimecia cannot die. She cannot perish. She's there, but she does not have her lover. So when you think about that story, it really is played out in Final Fantasy VIII. From our perspective as believers, in the idea that Rinoa is Ultimecia. We cannot get away from it. In the sense that every time we play this game, this is what we believe. So for us, it is our reality. So, but basically, I would say that, what was I looking for? I know I was looking for something. I was looking for something. But what was I looking for? Yes, I was looking for the name, and I basically talked about it. I would also like to talk about this channel. This person have done some good work regarding, and I do not know if he, if these are his videos, because I have a feeling I remember those videos being shown before. But nonetheless, this person has put out some interesting Final Fantasy VIII content that I quite like, because he is talking about the Ultimecia is Rinoa belief, which many people malign, especially these days. So it's somewhat rare to find people talking about Ultimecia being Rinoa. But anyhow, as I was saying, that idea of finality, it no longer is in these games that are produced by Square Enix, alright? But it was in the Squaresoft games. So what we received from Final Fantasy VIII, for those of us who know, or rather for those of us who believe, I mean to say, in this, in what we believe to be esoteric regarding this game, we have no problem with the story, because we consider this story to be one of the most complete, if not the most complete, Final Fantasy story we have ever really experienced, because they gave us everything. They gave us the past, they gave us the future, they gave us a woman who is in love, and a woman whose mind has been transformed by this concept of strength that once gave her strength, but now is sort of has sort of become something pretty warped. At one point in time, Squall was grieving. At another point in time, Ultimecia was grieving, and they sort of both, in a sense, this idea, this image, this concept of the strong lion. I think this is why Ultimecia and Squall are connected to it, because Rinoa was connected to it. And so, Rinoa had Zell, basically make her a copy of a particular ring, or, I forget, that particular thing in the story, but somehow Rinoa had Zell get it, and I think she made something similar, and they both had those matching images, so Rinoa had one too. So Squall has his, ring or necklace of the lion, and so does Rinoa. And so the idea of her really connecting to that concept, and I think what was it, Squall said, it is a symbol of strength or something like that. If you know anything about thought forms, if you know anything about magic, we have to talk about magic. I myself am a Christian, but I have to talk about magic when I'm talking about this game, because the game is about magic. So this content may not necessarily be something many of my more religious viewers may be interested in that I've talked about religious topics, not necessarily on this aspect, but I think we can all learn something about the cultural implications of magic being in video games. But nonetheless, what I mean to say is this. Thought forms have to do with an idea, a concept, that is something that is strongly held in your mind, a strongly held belief, a strongly held principle, something of that sort. And for me, I think that Ultimecia, even by appearance, comes to represent the principle of the griever. Because in a sense, if you think about the protagonist of the Raven in Edgar Allan Poe, that is a griever. But instead of him grieving, we have Lenore grieving. And the story is far different. That is a play on the Raven. And it is done in such an esoteric fashion that it really is beautiful. when you think about it in this way and when you have the belief that I have. Because when you think about, that romance being that deep, where, wow, oh my, these writers were, Kojima or whoever, and whoever was helping him did this. If you thought about it like this game would be probably your most beloved game. You would probably think, wow, no, this is probably one of the best romance stories I know about. And they finally meet again in the promised meadow. But before they meet, you see, Rinoa's face shifting into Ultimecia's face over there in the, in the ballroom that Squall and Rinoa met at. I mean, everything sort of links together very well. This is why I believe the way I do. This is just such, and I have to really change the vocabulary in my opinion, because this is what I believed when I was a kid playing the game. When I was a kid playing the game, when there was no Square Enix, everything was Squaresoft, everything was, you get one game, that is it. The game is over. You get one Final Fantasy VII, no sequels, no Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, no Ever Crisis, no Crisis Core, none of that. You get what you get. You get what Hironobu Sakaguchi and his team made for you, and that is what you have. You have 4 discs. You have 4 whole discs to experience what Final Fantasy is, and you get a Final Fantasy. And that was how it used to be. And a lot of newer Final Fantasy players, they may not realize how special that was, but it was quite special. So, for many of us. And so many of us who played Final Fantasy VIII, we just said, wow. It really does seem like Ultimecia hath no background story at all. When you think about the name Ultimecia, okay? This was a woman who loved her husband so much she was willing to drink his own ashes. Okay, this was a woman who was willing to drink the ashes of her dead husband. Lenore was a woman who was deceased from the protagonist of The Raven. What if the story was different and Lenore just ended up living for eternity? When you think about how a story like that would be created, that is amazing in terms of a concept that you could think about. Okay. Now let me type in this and we can learn a little bit about Artemisia, because I think both names are relevant. I think they intentionally chose to spell her name Artemisia. They are doing wordplay in Final Fantasy VIII. Whoever was writing that was very skillful because they were able to convey multiple things at once. They were telling you, yes, she is the ultimate sorceress. But at the same time, they were telling you, oh, but we also want to say that, we want to give a nod to Artemisia. So they were able to do that in a very excellent way. Some people have a problem with the English script, but they were able to convey 2 ideas at once. So, this woman, who Artemisia is historically, is about extreme love. Now, I have not read this article in particular, but I know this woman was basically, she was drinking his ashes. She preserved his ashes. This woman who was both a bereaved sister and a widow took a measure of it mixed with a beverage. There are some women who actually do this in real life, who still do this. There are some women who still do this, and when you see the old style sort of really gothic little interesting aspects of the castle of Ultimecia as well as the home of Rinoa, they have similarities, do they not? And when you look at the fine art in Rinoa's castle, doth it not look somewhat like this art here? It hath a classical look to it. And Artemisia is a classical figure, is she not? So this is Ultimecia, the ultimate. Now, Ultimecia, as a historical figure, is an extreme figure. The protagonist in The Raven is an extreme protagonist, and his love for Lenore is extreme. If Rinoa is the name that sort of is a variation of Lenore, the Irish name Lenore, as far as I remember, that meaneth light, and that Lenore itself cometh from another name, Eleonora, then you really have to think about this. This is itself a very, the influences that this story taketh, for those of us who believe this, is incredible. For me, there is no Final Fantasy game better than this. I have not even gotten to specifics yet, but basically I'm just talking in an impromptu manner, in an improvisational manner, about what I believe. This was a game I played a long time ago as a kid, and I really liked it, and I had this idea about it. I said, when I was younger, basically a teenager, I basically had this idea. I said, I really like this game. I think Rinoa's Ultimecia. And a lot of people are saying that. A lot of people today are scared to say that. But I think that Yoshinori retracting his statement about what he said, which was, if you did not know, why would you say it? I think that's quite irresponsible on his part, but he eventually retracted it. But I think a lot of what he saith has to do with the fact that Square Enix is a company they no longer have much in the way of integrity. They want profit above all else, and they do not really care about Final Fantasy as a franchise. They, in the sense that they're not connected to it like Hironobu Sakaguchi was. Hironobu Sakaguchi was connected to it. Hironobu Sakaguchi felt something for it. But the people at Square Enix, whoever is in charge now, they do not really care. The writers, I know they do. I am sure that they do. At least for the most part. But are they going to make games like they used to under Hironobu Sakaguchi? No. They are not doing that. What they are doing is losing money because they cannot replicate the success of Final Fantasy VII, VIII, and IX in particular. Those three games in particular were amazing. And Squaresoft was able to amass a fortune off of those games. They were famous. They are still famous today. They were absolute masterpieces. Oh my goodness, they were masterpieces. In the sense that those games were both long and substantial. And there was so much to them. The music was excellent. The length of the storyline was excellent. The dialogue, it was like reading a visual novel, a book, and playing an RPG at the same time. Okay? It was pretty amazing. And there were so many nuances to the story of Final Fantasy VIII that it really is the one that I like the most. Alright? And I have to say that Square Enix just simply is not a company that can even compete to the old Squaresoft. They just cannot do it. And so, sharing that information with you, do with it what you will, really. I am learning more in the sense that I'm trying to compile my information. I'm trying to do research in the thought forms, spirits and enchantment, because this is what the game has to. It has a lot to do with that. These guardian forces are a major part of the story. And those of us who believe Rinoa's Ultimecia, well, it maketh even more sense to us. Because the role of Griever, who is literally a guardian force that you name, an actual guardian force, not just a piece of jewelry. He hath a purpose in the story. And so, learning about the actual, magical influences of a concept. What real world influences does this concept of guardian force have? Does it have any type of how should I say, connection to guardian angel, guardian spirit, the Tibetan tapa, which is an idea that you can basically somehow create a thought form. All of these ideas are magical ideas, and you're in the RPG. Many of the role-playing games that we play, in regard to video games, they do have a lot of magical concepts that many people are unaware of. And I would like to talk about some of those things and really, peradventure, do my part in convincing ye that, yes, these creators of these games really do put that much thought into the games they create. Some people will never believe it, but in a sense, that is sort of the appeal of making esoteric story. You can put something in the story that people do not know about, and that, some people will say, "Oh, I see what you did there," but unless you see it and you understand it yourself, you will not really be able to have a grasp upon it. Other people say, "Oh, no, that's not true. That's not there. You're crazy." But, some of us beg to differ. Anyhow, viewers, now isn't that something? Even this AI, Shantoto still beats. She has the first place score. Shantoto has the first place score. Even though Ultimecia wins, she still cannot really outclass Shantoto. I mean, that's a bit of Dissidia lore for you. For those who know, you know. All right. Excuse me. This is sort of funny, but actually, Shantoto could beat Ultimecia any day of the week. When you've seen what she can do, oh no, Shantoto can literally. It was a really. I actually like that rivalry between Shantoto and Ultimecia. That was one of the reasons I bought Final Fantasy Dissidia NT. That was just such an excellent cutscene, even though there are not many like that. There are not many good cutscenes in Dissidia NT. That was something very memorable. Anyhow, viewers, I think I should probably end this video here. May you be blessed, and farewell.